I have a pocket watch that tells past jokes instead of time, and it is an inconvenient thing to carry when you live by the hour of other people's amusement. When the watch opens, the hands do not move. They click through punchlines already delivered and show me, with merciless precision, the moment a crowd leaned forward and released something like surrender. I keep it folded in the inner breast of my coat, where the matte paint on my face smudges against the cloth and leaves the faintest borders of my life. It is at once comfort and indictment, for it reminds me that I can make strangers forget their week and still return home with an empty ribcage. The boy's name is Theo. He is the sort of child who believes in the weather in the way grown people believe in their debts, inevitable and capable of surprising you. He sat in the front row on the damp bench because his boots leaked and because he had nowhere else urgent to be. His hair, which never quite dried, clung to his forehead in little salted curls. He did not clap when the show began. He stared as if he were trying to work out how novelty fit into the shape of things. People like Theo do not come to the circus to be completed. They come to see whether delight can still be trusted. I had planned the evening like a man preparing a recipe he would not taste, a humble array of pratfalls, a story about a baker who fell in love with a rolling pin, a routine to thin the crowd's protective layers. I practiced the timing in the mirror until my eyebrows grew tired and my paint chapped in the corners like the edges of old maps. August counted the applause with his brass counter at the ready, as if the metal could translate wonder into solvency. Etta sat near the tent's mouth, a small lighthouse of patchwork and fogged lenses, cataloguing the weather and, I think, cataloguing my tells. Nell swung like a taut thought overhead, the fabric of the tent catching and tightening around her rhythm. I had not planned on telling that story. The one that came out of me was not the baker's, nor the rolling pin. It was older, narrower, and more dangerous, the story of the patron who kept his sorrow folded like a napkin and who once, when I did a careless joke at a private grief, turned his face and said nothing. He did not laugh. He left the city the next day, and the sort of things people call pacts and charms began to collect around his absence. Someone somewhere called for order. Weather makers and municipal clerks drew up agreements the way other people wrote love notes, in neat columns and with a hope that neatness could last longer than wet. The memory felt like a stone in my mouth. I told it anyway. I told it not as explanation, but as an apology in miniature. I described the exact ridiculousness of the moment, my exaggerated sneeze, my slapstick tumble that landed like a spoon in a cup. I painted the man because I could not help it. It is what I do with the same affectionate cruelty I reserve for myself. I let the shame sit at the table like an unwanted guest, and I offered it tea. For a long, suspended beat, the tent held its breath. People do not know what to do with raw, unperformed truth from a performer. Either they applaud the novelty of confession, or they throw things. Once, in some more ambitious era, a confession would have been sold, measured, and rebranded as sentiment. Tonight, there was only the small sound of someone in the back shifting, a child's boot on a wooden bench catching on the grain. Then Theo laughed. It was not obliging. It was not an audience laughter learned from sitcoms and social cues. It was the sudden exhalation a thing makes when it is relieved of fear. It cracked first like a bell struck, and then unraveled into a series of surprised tinkles, each one loosening someone's face. Laughter moved from Theo like light moves from a bare bulb. It drew the tent toward itself. What I had always been telling myself about laughter was that it was a property you expended on others. I had imagined it like coin spent, cannot be double spent, noble in sacrifice. But Theo's laugh was not a coin. It was contagion, it was invitation. It seemed to say, look, that thing you hide is smaller on the inside. It conceded that the man I had mocked might still be a person who deserved something softer than scorn. Faces changed. The woman who had knitted her brows through the whole performance unclenched. A man 2 rows back let his jaw slack and then smiled like he had found a door in a wall he had never noticed. August's counter fell silent for a tick, and when he moved his hand it shook, as if he had been looking at a small animal. Etta's fogged spectacles cleared. She blinked as if rain had stopped on her lashes. Marigold hung her hands in the silence, and then mimed a small, surprised clap that made the children near the front giggle. Nell's foot on the high wire tapped an extra beat, a small celebratory punctuation I saw only because I was watching for it. The laughter spread not as a performance but as permission. I had been trying desperately to take my laugh back, to find the place where the world had misfiled it and return it to myself with a receipt and an apology. Instead, in offering my shame rather than a hollow joke, I had accidentally given it away, and the giving done honestly and without calculation made something change. The auditors clerks those grey papery things that appear like a mistaken weather front whenever civic rules shuffle in pressed at the tent's edge. They rustled like dry leaves as they tried to catalogue the sound. It is a thing of bureaucratic manners to treat gifts as taxable. The ledger they carry has always loved to weigh, but a laugh offered freely is not a thing that composes itself into rows and columns. It resists collation. When they tried to mark it down, their ink blurred. Pages stuck together as if wet foldings had gone inside. I watched, with the peculiar mixture of glee and maternal concern I feel for the fragile things of the world, as their numbers bled into each other and refused arithmetic. The auditor did not laugh. It is not built to, but it flinched in the manner of an organism denied its habitual meal. Its umbrella cracked a centimeter as if to open, and then it closed again, puzzled by the texture of what had been offered. Somewhere in the back of the tent, a clerk swore under his breath. The word sounded like paper tearing. After the show, we did not immediately know what had changed. The tent was still patched in places and missing in others. The brass counter still clicked, though it now counted in a rhythm that seemed less like ownership and more like curiosity. People remained people, tired, hungry, full of lives that would not be fixed by applause. But there were strange differences. A woman who sold umbrellas in the market stood with her own among the crowd and let it rain on its handle for the pleasure of seeing the droplets bead. A pair of shopkeepers exchanged a loaf of bread for a joke and left without keeping the receipt. Etta folded her ledger back into her coat and slid it into a hidden pocket, as if it had become too heavy to carry on the outside. I noticed the change in myself first as a small inhalation. It was not the kind of roaring guffaw I had once expected, nor did it feel like theft completed. Instead, it arrived as a warmth behind the sternum, like the memory of a song before you remember the words. My mouth twitched, not with practiced clonery, but with something soft recognition. I tried, cautiously, to make a sound in answer. It came as a thin, rusty chuckle and then again louder. When a woman 2 rows back mimed feeding a potato to her dog, an absurdity she had invented, just to see whether the sound would come back if it were allowed to be useless. The laugh returned in increments. It came to me like spare keys found in a drawer, each one fitting a different lock. A stout, small guffaw when Marigold, in the quiet, mimed a petition to the clouds. A soft snort when Nell, who could no longer resist, came off her wire and bounded down to demonstrate exactly how ridiculous one can look when one is trying not to be measured. Each time the room gave it back freely, without passbook or tally. I remember thinking then that this was not regaining in the way lost things are regained, returned as they were, but rather in the way a house is rebuilt after a storm. Some beams reappear, some walls are new, and a window might be where a door once was. The laugh I had is not the same laugh I will have tomorrow. It is also not the laugh I had before the curse. It is lopsided, generous, threaded with other people's echoes. It is a communal thing. It is also, importantly, more difficult for ledger-based powers to swallow. That night, in the tent's half-light, the auditor came close enough for me to feel the chill that surrounds institutional certainties. It did not attack. It audited. It set its cloud-stitched ledger upon a small folding table as if to show decorum. Several clerks hovered like exhausted moths. The auditor's voice, if it has one, was like the turning of a page. You offered a laugh, it said, or perhaps it only arranged the words in order and let them fall. Please provide provenance. It came from the boy, I said, because at that moment facts are small and telling, and from me, and from whoever chose to laugh. Chain of custody unclear, the auditor replied. It spoke in a tone protocol might have, and it looked, impossibly and with all the earnestness of the rule-bound, disappointed. Chain of custody is the point, Etta said. She had come to stand beside me, her coat a small, comforting chaos. We are not selling this. We are giving it. The auditor's ledger leaned forward as if listening. For every moment it tried to catalogue the sound slipped. There was a tiny, almost impertinent music to the way the crowd refused to be neatly recounted. Someone in the audience, a baker, Mrs. Finch, it turned out, stood and recited the exact time a joke had let her breathe again. She had laughed when her husband returned a sock he had lost in the war. Her voice was small but precise. The clerks tried to write it down. The ink ran in tiny rivers, refusing to take the shape of law. That is not to say the auditor did not try to take from us what it could. It took notes. It filed. It watched for slippage. But the act of giving had altered the texture of the thing they wanted. A laugh sustained by generosity is not the same nutritional matter as a laugh scraped off the top of somebody's suffering and bartered away. It is less useful for their purposes. In arithmetic, communal goods are messy remainders. The auditor likes clean sums, so the ledger coughed. And in the cough of the ledger there was a sound that was almost a victory. There was a small cost. When you begin to give things away, you find you are forced to reckon with what you will not hold. August, who had always measured applause like credit, sat on the curb and looked guilty as a child caught counting sweets. He told me, later, that he had been afraid not of losing money, but of losing the illusion that our art could be an asset to be amortized. I watched him that evening set his brass counter in his lap, and then, rather than click it, touch it like an old friend who needs a word. This could be a fraud, he said to me later as the tent folded around us in small, sleepy breaths. Or it could be a revolution, and I have been paid in both caution and pride. The revolution, I think, is quieter than the word suggests. It is the exchange of a thing that costs little to give and much to hoard. It is the unlearning of the habit that equates amusement with ownership. Theo came to stand on the edge of the ring later, his boots squelching, his pockets full of small found objects. He had scavenged metal washers, a thimble, the flattened cap of a soda bottle. He handed me one and then, because kindness in a child has no ledger, asked for nothing. Did it help? He asked. I think so, I said, surprised that I could say I think without stuffing a receipt into the sentence. It started something. Theo grinned and then, in a manner I would later write into my watch as a past joke, told me he had once made a sound like the sea by blowing through a straw, and that sometimes the sea sounded like a laugh if you listened upside down. He was serious about his analogies, which is a trait the world should license. Later, when the rain thinned and the town began to gossip like birds, I realized that the change was not a miraculous reclamation so much as a reconfiguration. Laughter returned not as a single discovery but as a series of small, generous acts that let it leak back in. I found that when I gave a laugh to a child, to a neighbor, to a woman mending a torn curtain, the gesture warmed me. Sometimes it warmed me immediately into sound. Sometimes it left me with a sense like the aftertaste of berries, surprising and not wholly comprehensible. That night I slept better than I had in years, and yet sleep made me cautious. Pains of habit have an appetite. Curses have relatives who visit in the dry months. The auditor would not relinquish its appetite entirely. The ledger had not been destroyed. It had simply been foiled at dinner. When I woke, the tent still bore holes. Gus had been up all night regreasing some of his absurd contraptions. Marigold had not been able to contain herself and performed a pantomime of someone sitting contentedly under a rain flume. Nell practiced a new drop that made her laugh every time she landed. August had been reading the accounts with a look that suggested he was learning a new language, one that appreciates ritual as both comfort and economy. I kept checking my chest to see whether the leak would become a river. It had not. It was, at present, a steady dribble of possibility. It is a strangely adequate way to measure hope, not by the certainty of shout, but the regularity of small returns. There is a hook in all of this, of course. The man who was once a patron did not dissolve into the weather. The auditor did not go on holiday. There are towns that prefer order to laughter and councils that would rather prove prudence than tend to hearts. If there is a moral in this interim relief, it is complicated. Giving my laugh away will not rebuild our tents alone. It will not make Gus' contraption stop creaking, nor will it make August's worries evaporate like prints in a new puddle. But it does something that ledgers cannot tax. It invites people to practice being ridiculous again. Tonight we had succeeded in a small way. The auditor had bared a flaw, and in doing so it made manifest an opportunity. We had turned the tent into a place where confession could be funny, because it was also honest. We had discovered that a child's laugh is both oxygen and permission. It can be inhaled and exhaled by the community without turning into a commodity. I closed my watch and slid it into the pocket where it keeps its old jokes. Its hands show me the neat little map of what I have done. If I am to get laugh back, fully and unashamed, it will be by giving, not hoarding. The idea sits in my ribs like a seed. Outside the tent, the rain had paused, not gone. It was the kind of pause that speaks, linger, consider, repair. Tomorrow, we would ask the storm for a favor. We would ask some townspeople to keep watch on puddles as if they were sacred bowls. We would propose a ceremony, small, definite, public, that might teach a community how to tend a shared laugh. Etta had already been muttering a plan about ledgers that could hold stories instead of invoices. Gus was tinkering with an adaptation of his machine that would stitch fabric and stitch memory. August muttered about negotiations with town clerks. Marigold was already inventing a pantomime for the first ritual day. I fell asleep on the edge of the ring that night with a smile that was not quite mine and not quite a stranger's. It felt, for the first time in a long time, like a tool I could use. The laugh I give may not come back as the exact thing it was, but as I lay listening to the faint drip of rain from the tent's eaves, I realized that I would rather rebuild in increments than watch the whole unravel into neatness. And because this is a story and stories like to push forward, I should tell you this when dawn spreads its thin gray hand across the town. The first person to commit the new ceremony will be someone you might not expect. Their act will be small and luminous, and will force an entire magistracy to consider whether weather is merely meteorological, or whether it can be civic agreement renegotiated. If that sounds like a promise, it is only partial. The auditor will not surrender without making us prove that what we offer is not chaos but covenant. We have begun to learn the difference between spectacle and ritual. And in that learning there is work, danger, and if luck is generous joy. But for now, with Theo's laugh still ringing faintly in my ears and a thin warmth in my ribs that might be mistaken for hope, I slept. I slept as one might sleep after giving away a small thing and receiving back a larger one, surprised, cautious, and quietly certain that the next morning would demand we be brave in very particular ways. And we were, in ways ordinary and remarkable. The next day, before the formalities, a child with a straw taught an old man how to make the sea sound like a laugh. That sound was not a restoration. It was a beginning. It is the sort of beginning that requires patience, and we had discovered how to be patient together. The tent did not mend overnight. The auditor remained awake, its ledger humming like a wasp trapped in a jar. but it had to learn that some things cannot be reduced to columns. That realization, small and precise, is the shape of our advantage. We had, if only for a night, made an economy of generosity. The work, as any sensible person knows, is to scale it. The next exchange will be harder. The next town may prefer a different currency. So I keep giving. It is not heroic. It is not convenient. It is, however, the only way I know to coax a laugh back from the place where it has been kept. And as the rain prepares to visit the next town, we practice what we can: honesty on stage, knitted ritual in the wings, and patience in our pockets. There is a cliff ahead, the kind that plays coy until you are very close. We will approach it the way Nell approaches a new wire, with measurement, with confidence, and with a small, inevitable leap. The auditor is watching. The townspeople are learning. I have a pocket watch that tells me jokes that are already finished. That is all, and that is enough. The laugh I have been given will have to be defended, not sheltered. And defending it will require making something that looks less like entertainment and more like promise. Tonight, the boy Theo will dream strange sea laughter and perhaps wake with a new way of blowing through straws. Tonight, I will practice giving away more than jokes. I will practice offering permission. That is the only currency that will make the ledger's ink run and the auditor's umbrella fold in embarrassment. The trick, as always, is to make it look easy. It never is, but we have begun. There is rain in the forecast. I never thought the fittest muscle in the circus was the one that learned how to ask for help. We had always been a company of doers, tossers, catchers, stitchers by habit, and yet there, with the damp of the trial still clinging to our cuffs, the most practical revolution we managed was to ask the townspeople to keep us alive. It began as a small, almost stupid idea. Why not invite the audience to take part in the mending? It sounded theatrical when said out loud, absurdly so. August barked at it first, as ringmasters do when faced with the unfamiliar. "We are entertainers, not charities," he said, counting something invisible on a brass counter that used to mean numbers and now seemed to mean less. But Etta, who keeps lists as if they were talismans, had already made a column in one of her notebooks labeled Care, Town-Based. And under it had penciled a plan that looked suspiciously like common sense. "You make it sound practical," I told her the night we outlined the idea beneath the droop of a half-mended banner. My breath fogged. Her spectacles fogged along with it, and she peered at the columns as though they were constellations. "You always make anything sound practical, even prophecy." She smiled in that way she does when she is both wry and tired. "Practicality is just another name for hope that's willing to account for itself," she replied. It was the kind of thing that might have brought about a laugh in someone else, spry and slightly ridiculous, but I felt the sentence land like a pebble in a hollow. It made the hollow resonant without producing sound. That evening we convened the troupe, and some of the locals in a circle of oilcloth and lantern light while the rain fretted at the edges of our tent. I observed the faces. I had been doing that since I could stand and pay attention. The carpenter whose hands trembled from too many winters. The baker whose oven smelled of old sugar and new forgiveness. A schoolteacher who smelled perpetually of chalk. Each face was a ledger, as Etta might have said, entries in a life that sometimes balanced and sometimes did not. We spoke plainly. August, who had once measured applause like currency, tried to make the economics sound like a balance sheet. "We propose a system of ceremonial repair," he said. "A subscription of sorts." People laughed at the word subscription because we are a circus and we use old words and make them funny. But then Etta explained in quieter terms, small, voluntary rituals where townspeople would come to witness and swear care to one part of the canvas, or to a performer, or to a rod and peg in exchange for a seat, a meal, or simply the knowledge that they had helped keep a small wonder intact. No tickets sold in the old sense. Instead, promises exchanged, vows that had the feel of something intimate and binding, like a letter left in a pocket. "We aren't asking you to buy us," I said, because to some ears it would have sounded classless. We're asking you to own us a little. Not in ledger terms, but as a shared thing, a thing we watch over together. The first time we tried it, the idea felt ridiculous and fragile. Gus, who once built a counting machine to understand laughter, surprised us all by volunteering to alter it. I had thought he would cling to figures as August did. Instead, he saw in the contraption an instrument to listen in a different register. If the machine can hear frequency, he said, it can hear other frequencies. Why not vows? Or stories? Why not the particular noise people make when they're promising themselves something? A laugh is a frequency, yes, but so is a promise when it's true. He set about the work with the solemnity of someone performing a small surgery on a beloved, grimy animal. He dismantled gears that had once been satisfied with counting chuckles, cleaned them with a newspaper that had once been a circus program, and replaced the horn that used to bleat with a smaller nozzle that breathed out warm steam. He soldered with care. The device, once calibrated to twitch at a titter, now hummed to the cadence of spoken pledge. Nell volunteered for the first demonstration. Nell, who taught fearlessness and how to fall in ways that meant you'd be caught. If this goes wrong, you catch me, she told me, grinning. Her grin made the rope seem smaller and the sky bigger. She is a woman who pulls joy from risk like a rabbit from a hat. That night the tent smelled of boiled coffee and wet wool and the peculiar electric scent of things newly fixed. We let the townsfolk in, but not into the seats as before. Instead, we asked them to gather around the seam that had unstitched when the auditor had been counting too closely. Each person was given a small ribbon and a prompt, a promise, a small form of care to be spoken into the ribbon. It had to be practical. I will mend this hinge if it breaks, someone said. I will water the planted banner flowers every Wednesday, said another. A child, blunt and brilliant as only children are, said, I will tell jokes if you forget them. Gus positioned his modified device at the seam. It didn't look much different, a coil of brass and wire. A horn that now exhaled steam like a sleeping kettle, but when a promise was spoken into the ribbons and tied to the seam, the machine hummed. The hum was not loud. It was the sound of a hinge acknowledging being oiled, of a clock's innards consenting to tick. The seam, which had been a threat, shivered as if hearing the names of its keepers. The fabric drew a little tauter. Nell climbed the rope as the crowd watched, and when she danced along it, the motion wasn't a trick to get applause. It was a stitch too. When she looped a ribbon through the seam, Gus' device latched the thread with a small mechanical kiss and a spit of warm steam. The tent didn't mend itself all at once. Tiny stitches pulled the old cloth into agreement with itself. People who had been on the margins of the town's life found themselves placed at the literal heart of the canvas. It was communal absurdity, which is to say it was precisely what we needed. I stood at the fringe and did the thing I always did. I watched. But I also did another thing. I offered. I had spent years giving away what I did not own, laughter that would never fit in my own ribs, and now I found that the act of presenting a laugh deliberately as a gift shifted something. To give laughter away for the sake of repair was not theft. It was barter of a different sort. I told a joke about a goose who once tried to audit a rain cloud's feather count and received, in reply, a chorus of little human snorts and startled snickers. A man I liked for his practical kindness laughed and then said he would keep the seam dry with an umbrella on fair days. A woman whose hands had been empty for some years laughed, then quietly told the seam she would watch it from her bakery window each evening. The pleasure I felt when their faces opened small, unmeasured, was not the tidal lift I used to provide on stage. It was more like the warmth that comes from wrapping your hands around a mug you did not have to pay for. It warmed me enough to make a noise that might have been a laugh slip out of me, the first tiny absurdity that sounded like me in some time. It was small and it leaked into my chest in drops, but drops gather. August watched all of this with an expression that had a number of thoughts in it. Sometimes he still pulled out the brass counter and clicked it between his fingers. The habit was like an old talon. It lived in him even as he tried to grow a gentler hand. I once would have ridiculed him for his constancy. By then his constancy had become a kind of frightened courage. He loved the circus enough to be uncomfortable experimenting with its business model. "We will keep our dignity," he said to me later when we were alone, "and our books. We can keep both," I told him, though I didn't quite know if I meant it. I had seen the way his jaw unclenched when the baker promised to watch our seams. He was not being converted by sentiment so much as by the plainness of watching others stand up to their small parts of the world. Gus' contraption did more than stitch. In the days that followed, he tinkered it into a portable thing that could be carried between towns. It stitched not only with thread, but with a peculiar glue he mixed from boiled sugar and old program paper pulp. It stitched when it heard a vow, when it heard not only the sound, but the intent behind the sound. Etta wrote down the parameters. A promise had to be local, feasible, and repeated by at least 3 people before the machine would engage. It felt bureaucratic in the most domestic of ways, rules not to constrain joy, but to ensure that when someone promised to care, they would be likely to keep it. Meanwhile, Marigold, whose silence had been a kind of armor, found her voice in the pressure of necessity. I had always thought of her silence as an immaculate thing. She made absence into a presence so eloquently that sometimes words seemed gauche beside her hands. But the new kind of performance ritual rather than spectacle made space for speech that had the shy quality of a plant pushing through cobblestones. She began with fragments. The first night she spoke, it was a single consonant that sounded like M, the sort of warm, cautious vowel that a person uses when testing whether something will hold. It was only later, when a child asked if the mime could name the color of the rain, that Marigold said yes in a way that startled us all. The word barely existed, thin paper speech, but the children heard it and responded with a map of noises and then laughter. She learned to say small, practical words. Yes, watch here. Each one was a stitch in a different fabric, speech mending a person as well as the tent. We adapted the performances too. The old big top routines felt obscene in their previous extravagance. They had been about talent put on a stage in a way that said, "Watch me, pay me. I will make you forget." Now our acts were shorter, less polished, and framed as rites. Nell's aerial became an offering. She wove ribbons of town hopes into the sky and brought them down as blessings. Gus' shows were demonstrations of repair mechanics. He explained with the patient pride of someone who loves both machines and people. August curated these acts not with the eye of a banker, but with the eye of a father choosing songs to keep from going extinct. What it cost us was immediate and practical. We lost some regulars who preferred the old bargain of spectacle. People who wanted to convert everything into a consumable commodity drifted away. But we gained something else: neighbors who would show up not because they wanted to be entertained, but because they wanted to be necessary. The difference is subtle and large. Necessity binds you in a way that applause never did. There were setbacks. The auditor did not vanish. It had been rattled by our trial, moved by our mockery perhaps, but not oblivious. Once, toward the end of a damp morning, after a particularly tender repair, where a retired sailor had offered to keep watch over our rope lines, a paper storm passed along the ridge of the tent. It was a clatter of clerks, grey and flitted, tiny and officious, all moving in a gust that smelled like old ledgers. They fluttered past the seam we had mended and inspected the stitches with the cold, impartial interest of someone who reads everything as a column. They found our vow books and scowled, which is the only human-like expression a paper storm can muster, and one of them, a curled thing with an emblem like a zero on its lapel, paused. The emblem was an absence, a punctuation, a thing that ate up the rest of the sentence. It tilted its head and, I swear, scratched at a seam as if it thought a stitch could be accounted for with a pencil. We held our breath. There was a moment long enough for me to remember every face in the ring where the tent felt like a living thing deciding whether it wanted to be kept around. It seemed to shiver, and then, as if in answer to our collective promise, it steadied. The paper storm moved on. The zero-lapel clerk left a faint dampness on a folding chair and went searching for the town council's minute books. The truce, I realized, was not a victory so much as a treaty with moving borders. I had a night later where the sound of laughter slipped out of me like a shy animal. It was not the full-bodied guffaw I used to trade in. It was a thin, imperfect thread of sound that I offered up in the middle of a repair ceremony. I gave it away to a widow whose hands trembled less when she held my wrist, and the pocket watch that tells past jokes ticked too loudly. She laughed not at me exactly, but with the story I told about the goose and the accounting cloud, and then, puncturing the laugh, she cried. The laugh and the cry braided together. What I felt in return was not a trade of goods, but a return of company. It felt like someone handing me back the other half of a mitten I had unknowingly lost. There were practical consequences. The stitch machine learned what vows looked like and refused to work on promises that were vague or selfish. It refused the sort of oath that was a single person's grand idea of charity. The machine was not moral in a philanthropic sense. It was pragmatic. It wanted to see repeated local attention. If a town promised to watch the tent for a year and then actually showed up on a Wednesday to do so, the machine would be satisfied. If the vow was performative, the machine coughed and stayed still. Gus liked that. He respected machines that had opinions. We also made rules among ourselves. No one performer would be pinned as the singular source of laughter. We divvied up roles. Some of us led the ritual. Some of us fixed the ropes. Some of us taught the children jokes that were about sensible things, how to tie a knot, how to peel a potato, so that humor seeped into usefulness. We announced publicly and to one another that we would not use Gus' original contraption to simulate true amusement for profit. It was a moral line, and we drew it with the seriousness of people who are tired of finding loopholes. When Marigold finally said more than yes, when she told a small anecdote about a cat who had learned to read a program because it liked the smell of ink, the tent exhaled. Her voice broke and reknit something around us. She did not regain speech in a heroic burst. She reclaimed it in syllables that clung like burrs. Often she would lapse back into mime, but the stitches of spoken language remained like pearls along a rope. We made plans to travel town by town to ask for small truces with local councils and weather keepers to teach the method of ceremony we had improvised. Etta wrote a pamphlet practical, charming, and faintly mystical on how to structure vows so that they would stitch. August learned to carry his brass counter not as a hunger but as a relic. Sometimes he clicked it and smiled. Gus shipped the modified machine in a crate lined with old posters. Nell decided she would teach local children how to climb safely as part of a program to create local rope keepers. We were teaching people how to be partly responsible for wonder. It felt like teaching them to keep a fragile instrument warm instead of turning it into a curiosity. Our tent did not return to its former glory. No, it remained patched in places, lovingly puckered in others, but it stopped looking like a failure. The seams, once signs of impending oblivion, became places where names were sewn, dedicatory labels stitched in small loops for Old Tum, for the Tuesday bakers, for the girl who knew rain by smell. People came and touched the fabric with fingers that had known little touch. Those touches kept the canvas alive in a way brass counters never could. We left that town on the kind of morning that felt like a promise kept. The storm that had behaved sulkily for weeks lingered like a friend who refuses to leave, because there is unfinished conversation. We folded the tent differently now, not as a single-owned commodity, but as a communal ledger. August walked with his umbrella down, not closed like a fist, but open like an invitation. Etta tucked her pamphlets into her coat. Gus rode with a crate and a small, proud smile. Nell danced once more on a rope, just to say goodbye. Marigold kissed a child's damp hair and said, "Keep." It was the smallest sermon I had ever heard. I carried the pocket watch that told past jokes. It was heavier than it had been the day I started watching audiences like a botanist. This time it felt like ballast. I thought about the laugh I had given, the smallness of it, and how it had come back in minor increments. Perhaps that is the nature of mending. You do not restore a whole at once. You make small, repetitive acts of care until the whole, whatever that is, holds again. As we rolled the cart away, the tent settled on its wicket like a thing relieved. On the ridge a paper storm passed again, curious and thin, and I felt the old prick of wariness. The auditor's clerks are patient creatures. They have time in which to count and to return. Our treaty had been negotiated, not imposed. It required maintenance. We would travel to another town, make the same offer, ceremony for repair, vows for stitches. We would teach what we had learned and hope that the act of teaching itself would teach us more. There was a hum under the world, a low frequency of something unwritten. And sometimes on the road I thought I could hear counting in the wind, like a ledger's tongue, trying to name what it did not understand. If the auditor was listening, and of course it was, it always had been, then perhaps it would choose to notice the new currency we were inventing. Perhaps it would file our petitions under anomalous. Perhaps it would send a clerk with a zero label to watch a ribbon being tied. Perhaps it would decide that promises were unsightly and should be taxed. We did not know. We rarely did. We only had the small liturgy of what we could do. So we practiced it on the road, before dawn, when the world still tasted of wet iron and rubbed out chalk. I taught a baker's apprentice how to fold a seam. August hummed as he packed a parasol with gloves, as if the very act of packing might be prayer. Etta wrote down 2 more names in her new ledger, not as debts but as guardians. Gus cleaned his machine and muttered to it like a parent to a sleepy child. Marigold rehearsed a small monologue about a cat and a program. Nell balanced a ribbon on her fingertip and spun, saying, "For anyone who needs a knot to hold, I have learned over the years that add up to a life of pratfalls and quiet cataloguing. That the sound of a laugh is less like a bell and more like a leaky pot. It spills out, it stains. It sometimes starts a small fire if you stand too close. When I was young and still believed in singular solutions, I thought reclaiming my laugh would be a neat thing, retrieve the missing object, slot it back into my rib cage, and then continue with the day's booking. The world does not, as it turns out, arrange itself according to tidy inventory lists. We did not regain our circus in a single neat hour. We learned to make a life around the holes. That is how the last chapter of this particular traveling story began, around holes rather than with heroes. The tent that had once stood so confidently like an assertion now sagged like a sentence paused in thought. It is proper, perhaps, that the place which taught people to stand up and applaud should first teach us to sit down and listen. The rain that day was a citizen of many moods. It began, as rain does, by arriving and announcing itself. It tapped at the canvas like a distant typewriter, then decided it liked the rhythm and stayed. The smell of the wet dirt reintroduced itself to my nostrils like someone who had once been a lover and was politely asking permission to return. I held the pocket watch in my hand and felt the odd weight of stories. The watch does not tell time as much as it tells what has been laughed at. Its hands point to punchlines gone by, to the hiccup of a child's chortle in a parish hall, to the muffled snort of an oilman who thought himself too serious for anything but his ledger. I keep it because it keeps me oddly honest. Every joke it remembers is a small apology I have yet to make. Etta laid her ledger flat on the crate that serves as our communal table. The pages, when she opens them, make the sort of noise that is nearly the sound of somebody taking off an armor. She keeps lists the way other people keep photographs, careful corners, dates in the margins. The ledger had been heavy in a way I had not understood when I first looked at it. The way a folded letter can be heavy if the words have been weighed and measured for too long. "Read them," she said, not as a command, but as one might ask a clock for the time. I read the names aloud in the way you read things when you are unsure whether the sound will crack or settle. Each name is a small ruin and a small salvation. Listing them is a sort of arithmetic of regret. August stood a little apart, brass counter hanging from his belt like a confessionary object. And he did a thing with his jaw that meant he was trying to reconcile the cost of being human with the cost of maintaining an enterprise. Nell, as always, held the shape of a possibility in her stance. One would not think a person could be both danger and reassurance, but she managed it. Her hands have saved banners and hearts in equal measure. Gus tinkered at their feet, as if the truth could be learned by giving it a set of gears and 5 screws. Marigold watched, silent and bright as punctuation. Theo sat with his boots tucked under him and watched us like he was watching a small, collapsing planet and wanted to know if there would be fireworks. We had, in that week, decided on a small ceremony. The word ceremony in this circus is not an attempt at pomp. It is a machine for remembering. A ceremony can be a way to reorder grief, to make the motion of passing things on sensible and shareable so that they stop circulating like rumors and begin to sit where they belong, on tables, in pockets, within hands. The ritual we devised was not complicated. It asked for 3 things: a confession, a laugh given freely, and a small token to mark the exchange. The confession is not a thing that makes you clean. It is the kind of thing that opens a window in a room you have been living in with the curtains closed. We would stand, one by one, and say the embarrassing truth that had lodged in our throat like a stubborn seed. Then we would offer a laugh as though it were a coin, but one whose value was not equal to anything that could be counted. The token could be a button, a biscuit, a promise written on a napkin. We made rules because unorganized generosity is often as destructive as organized avarice. I volunteered to go first because, frankly, I am an excellent disappointment and have always been willing to demonstrate it for educational purposes. My confession, when it came, sounded smaller than I had rehearsed it to be and therefore truer. I spoke of the joke that had started all of this, the laugh at a private sorrow, offered thoughtlessly when I was young and crass with the energy of someone who did not yet understand the etiquette of a people's hurt. I said how the sound had left like a careless tenant and had not sent a forwarding address. I said how I had, for years, measured my success by the volume of other people's mirth, and how that practice had hollowed me out. Then I laughed, and it was nothing like the practiced cackle one uses on stage. It trembled like a leaf and was half apology, half surprise. I handed my laugh to Etta in the form of words and a small, ridiculous carved wooden whistle that used to belong to a child we had once made merry. It was an absurd object with no monetary worth, but in our new economy it possessed a lot of capital. Etta pressed the whistle to her lips and made no sound, and that silence became oddly the most honest thing. The townsfolk, when they came to see the circus, had brought with them neatness and untidiness in equal measure. They had a history of forbidding festivals in the dry months and of applauding like they were performing a civic duty. Some of them had attended our mock trial and had the taste for satirical justice. Others came because fried dough and acrobats are persistent as mosquitoes in summer. Theo's mother, who had been one of the first to lay down a second-hand quilt for us to sleep on, sat in the front row with her hands folded like a prayer. People were watching to see if we would fall apart spectacularly or merely fold gracefully. What happened is partly theatrical and partly weather. The rain, which had been a mood, decided to be an instrument. Its patter shifted into a rhythm that set the tent alive in a way I had not expected. The audience leaned in because the weather leaned in. Perhaps there is a human tendency to believe that when the sky pays attention, the rest of us ought to as well. Theo laughed first. His laugh was not a performance. It was the thing that happens when someone discovers a new page in a book and cannot help but turn it. It had a kind of moral clarity, the laugh of someone too young to have learned the complicated rules about which types of joy are appropriate in which kinds of mourning. He laughed at nothing more than the sight of me, trying to make a very sorry face, and tripping over the final syllable of my own confession. His laugh was candid and contagious in the exact way a flame is contagious when you are carrying a candle through a dark hallway. When a child's laugh begins, it pulls other sounds toward it. A merchant who had lost his wife to a winter cough snorted a sound that was more animal than human, then coughed and laughed again as if surprised by the generosity of his own noise. Mrs. Finch, who had fed us stale donuts in the last week, and who always smelled faintly of yeast and forgiveness, added a small, trembling sound that had the shape of both a sob and an applause. Someone from the back began to clap, not the formal, counted clap August loves, but a spontaneous, irregular tapping of palms that sounded like rain on old tin. The auditor came, because when you make a wave you ought to expect a meter to be placed in front of it. It arrived in the fumbling bureaucratic way of storms that have kept office hours for so long they forget to howl. There was a paper storm, and from within it no. Zero unfurled like an umbrella closing in on itself. Its ledger was the sort of thing that eats jokes and burps regulations. It stepped forward with the expression of someone who expects to be obeyed. Because that is what a ledger of long habit does. It confers as authority the way a badge confers permission. But the ledger hesitated when it met a sound given freely. It expected theft and hoarding and accounted for mirth. It did not expect attention given the way a gift is given. You can place a number in a column and then move on, but you cannot put a number into someone else's chest and call it done. That is, perhaps, the central failure of any bureaucracy trying to administer wonder. Numbers do not live in rib cages. The ritual went on and on because it had to. August, who had spent so long measuring applause that he could do it in his sleep, relinquished his brass counter into Marigold's hands and, for a short, luminous moment, forgot how to be an accountant. He told a story about a clown who had once tried to sell his own shoes in order to feed a dream, and how the price he asked was the thing that saved a child from going hungry. Nell offered up a dangerous anecdote about a time she had chosen to miss a catch to save a friend's hand. Gus produced, proudly and a bit shamefaced, a metal thing that was a button and a whistle and a promise all at once. He had welded a piece of the contraption that had almost made me laugh synthetically into a small relic meant to be pressed when someone needed permission to be silly. Marigold, who had been silent for so long she had become part of the tent, wrote a single line on a scrap of paper and folded it like a bird. She did not speak the confession aloud. She mimed the moment she had once said the wrong thing to the wrong person and watched, amazed, as the person left because silence had been cheaper than apology. Her mime was an exact, careful catalogue of how we hide. The paper she folded contained the single word forgive, and she handed it to a woman in the front row, as if it were an apple. The town, which had been a place of dry laws and soggy hearts, began to change its habits in small ways. People who had enforced festivals bans found themselves humming the rhythm of a child's laugh in the privacy of their kitchens. The auditor's clerks rustled their pages and found them damp and illegible at the edges. It is difficult to maintain authority when your records begin to look like seaweed. The crucial thing, if one may be allowed to say crucial about something of this nature, was not that I received the laugh back as a clean, single trophy. That would have been too tidy. Instead, giving away my laugh became a way of opening a space into which other people could return the sound in their own fashion. When I let go, my laughter uncoiled and traveled like a small animal, and in the course of its wandering it picked up other tastes. Mrs. Fink's modest, flower-dusted amusement, Theo's explosive chime, August's sheepish, counting chuckle. I received laughter the way a tree receives rain, not all at once but drop by drop, in drips and streams that seep into one place and then another. No. Ze fluttered its ledger in protest. Numbers, it declared in the dullest way possible, must be computed. The clerks, paper storms at their backs, attempted to write down the sounds and fit them into categories. Their pens spluttered. They could not find the right columns. They were very good at boxes. They were not good at the improvised architecture of shared mercy. There was a moment when the ledger tried to render forgiveness into a line item forgiveness, communal, quantity ambiguous, and the pen simply fell from the clerk's hand because ink refuses to behave like that. It stains, it runs, it does not attend to headings. The tent flapped in agreement. In the end, the auditor did not vanish in any monumental way. It did what institutions always do when they realize they cannot eat something. It adjusted its gaze and found another thing to count. We did not defeat bureaucracy so much as distract it with a festival of truth. The truce we negotiated was a pragmatic thing. The townspeople promised to remember to ask for rain and to offer ceremony, and in exchange the weather agreed to be a little less officious. It is not the sort of treaty one inscribes on marble. It is the sort that fits into pockets, and into the hems of coats, and into the quiet of a morning when someone apologizes to a puddle, and the puddle accepts it. There was another small victory that mattered more to me than any headline could. I discovered that laughter, when given away without the demand for return, tends to come back in ways that are not easily monetized. I had spent so long accruing other people's mirth that when a child's honest laugh unlocked a town's shuttered noises, it felt like a key that opens more than one door. My pocket watch kept ticking and showed me jokes that were no longer mine alone. There was a certain relief in that. The watch now tells not only who laughed and when, but also where it landed afterward. It is, quite literally, a map of generosity. We repurposed Gus' machine, as only sensible people do with failed inventions. He took the counting gears and replaced their teeth so they would sue instead of measuring. The thing that had nearly given me a counterfeit amusement became a device that stitched canvas while the rain fell. Its clunks and wheezes are now the sound of repair rather than the sound of accounting. August practices receiving applause without immediately converting it into debt. He staggers at times as a man who has learned to walk in new shoes. Etta reads the weather and the ledgers with a new eye, less police, more librarian. Nell teaches the apprentices that risk is a verb, not a currency. Marigold's voice returned in tents and doorways, small syllables that surprised us like a bird announcing morning. Theo has predictably decided his future is to be both loud and kind. The final storm did not sweep everything back into place like it was trying to correct a misprint. Instead, it settled, like a guest who has decided to stay. It lingered so long it started telling us stories about the sea. We learned to ask for it politely, not in a supplicating way, but in a ceremonial one. Asking for rain became a shared ritual between the town and the tent, and the weather itself an exchange in which people offered stories and songs and sometimes the occasional stale pastry. In return, the sky poured an opinionated, kindly drizzle that could not be forced into a ledger. And me, I do not know if my laugh is what it was before. I do not think there is a single original laugh any more than there is a single original gust of wind. The sound that now lives somewhere between my diaphragm and whatever is left of the old ribcage is flecked with other people's flour and the metal tang of Gus' improvised whistles and a child's tap running down a gutter. It is imperfect, it is communal, it is damp, it is mine only insofar as I helped shape it and tend to it. People often ask whether losing my laugh was a punishment or a lesson. I prefer the more useful and cumbersome answer: it was an invitation. Invitations, unlike punishments, are only as meaningful as the response they evoke. I chose to respond by giving. I chose to make ritual of generosity. I chose to accept that the circus would never be the same taut proclamation it once was, but could, perhaps, be a more honest kind of place, one that fixes holes as part of its show. We have adapted our bills and our brochures. Our posters now explain that we will appear in towns with rain and also in people who have learned how to forgive. Our tightrope is patched with borrowed cloth, each patch a small, scandalous tale of mercy. Gus stitching machine size, and sometimes it sounds like a lullaby. The pocket watch ticks on my wrist and tells jokes that have been scattered and returned. When a line points to an old jest, I remember who was laughing then, and who was not, and whom I might owe an apology. The ledger of Etus has turned into a garden of names, each one planted with a confetti seed. The final lines of the ceremony that day were not spoken as triumph so much as they were arranged like a seating plan, one part humility, one part stubbornness, one part pastry. We finished by making a small promise to the town and to the weather. We promised to show up. They promised to keep their reign a little less ledger-like. It was a modest treaty, and treaties are always more persuasive when they are small and local. As the audience dispersed, they left with the odd sensation of having been given a permission slip for life. People who had been taught to stifle a giggle at a funeral found themselves whispering jokes into the ears of the recently bereaved. Someone stapled the word forgive to a telephone pole and drew a garland of paper around it. The auditor, unable to digest generosity, moved on to reorganize a market schedule somewhere else. It is not noble. It is merely the way institutions behave when confronted with the surprising fact that human beings will do chaotic things for one another. At dusk, I stood by the tent flap and watched the town put itself back together very slowly. Tedious things like groceries and more interesting things like apologies slid down the street in equal measure. Theo kicked at a puddle, and the splash made a face on the water that looked suspiciously like my own surprised expression. He looked up at me and grinned, which is to say he asked no questions. "Will you still be funny?" Marin asked in his eyes, not his mouth. I answered by doing something I had not done in years. I laughed and then handed that laugh to the puddle. The puddle made a small noise like a child applauding. The pocket watch in my coat inhaled, and then exhaled a string of little remembered jokes that smelled faintly of yeast and machine oil and sunlight caught in a gutter. We do not know what will happen next. That is, perhaps, the most honest way of ending any story. We have stabilized into something less perfect and more livable. The tent will mend. The towns will remember ceremonially to ask for rain. The auditor will likely find new numbers to love. And I will continue to practice the awkward generosity of giving away my laugh so it can find its way back to me in 100 small, strange currencies. If you are waiting for a grand flourish in this last paragraph, a trumpet and a curtain call, I must disappoint you. The last sound is usually a puddle clearing its throat. There is, however, a small hook in the way the world hums after a good thing has been done. A knock at the caravan door in the middle of the night. The sort of knock I do not yet know how to answer. So we keep our lanterns lit and our patching needles sharp. We keep a pocket watch full of jokes and a ledger full of names that now smell less of guilt and more of bread. When the knock comes, I will open the door. I will find, perhaps, a person in need of a ridiculous story, perhaps a rain librarian who has misfiled a thunderbolt. Perhaps even the auditor returning with a box of sandwiches as a sign of uneasy truce. Or perhaps it will be nothing but the wind testing our hinges. The important thing is that the tent holds because we have learned to mend it together. The laugh I give is not returned to me neat and whole, but folded and refolded into the world like a good letter. I keep it because I also keep giving it away. And so the last line of this chapter is not a period so much as an invitation. If you ever find yourself in a town when the sky decides to cry, come see us. Bring a small token, a small truth, and a readiness to laugh in a way you might not have allowed yourself in a long time. If the pocket watch ticks against your wrist while you listen, do not be surprised. Jokes, like rain, have their own weather patterns. The knock at the door still waits, polite and persistent. We will open it together.